Hey, good day, everybody. We've got a couple minutes to the top of the hour. Hope everyone's doing well and excited about covering a little bit of Power Apps and Flow. So what we're going to talk about over the next hour is working with Power Apps and Flow, but Microsoft heavily promotes Power Apps and Flow as tools where you don't need professional developers. And so what I find is that there's no reason we should exclude professional developers when you're in Power Apps and Flow. And one of the things that is kind of unfortunate is a lot of the training and a lot of the how-to videos are kind of dummied down to kind of reach Microsoft's, target customer for this, which is the business user. So what I wanted to do is kind of look at things at a higher level from the perspective of a developer. Once again, if you haven't already taken the Preclass Survey, if you could just kind of take a minute and work through that. And what I wanted to show with this survey here, we've already got 15 people who have responded to it, is at the end, we're going to step through the solution that takes Microsoft Forms and basically looks at incoming submissions with Microsoft Flow and has to do a bunch of work processing things like JavaScript object notation to be able to write it into a Power BI data set. Okay, so thanks for everyone who's filling out those. A couple other things to note is that everything I'm going to be showing as far as slides and sample code can be downloaded from this location. So if I go to this one location here, note that I put together a GitHub repository at Critical Path Training / Power Apps Best Practices. And if I look down here, Power Apps for Developers, I can either download the PDF file or, I can simply open up the PDF file inside of GitHub. Okay, one last note before we get started. If you like this style of training over the next hour, Critical Path and me have an advanced Power Apps and Flow course, building business solutions with Power Apps and Flow, but enough of that. Let's get into what we're going to talk about over the next hour. So let's start with the Power Platform. Microsoft positions the Power Platform as the three amigos, Power BI and Power Apps and Flow. The more you learn about these three, the more you realize that Power Apps lives in one world and Power BI lives in its own world, and Power Apps and Flow, are quite different. Power Apps is built on the concepts of capacities and app workspaces, where Power Apps and Flow both, are built on top of the idea of an environment. Now, there's other things that extend the Power Platform, such as the common data model and the common data service for apps. And the way that we get our data, in and out of, whether it's a Power BI report or a Canvas app I've created with Power Apps or a Flow, we have connectors. And the idea of a connector is that someone, either at Microsoft or a different company, has written a little API wrapper that allows us to use a simple paradigm, but behind the scenes, it basically has the definition of what's required to basically call out to some service out on the internet, such as SharePoint or Power BI or Dynamics 365. Now, what we're going to talk about over the next hour is, probably the majority is going to look at building Canvas apps. Now, with Canvas apps, there's a lot of techniques that aren't rocket science. It's just putting together screens and building UI experiences. But we want to look at some of the best practices of how we build Canvas apps, the high-level design. We also want to look at some things that are just new and coming down the road, PowerApps Components, and I'm going to show you what those look like. And then a true developer framework called the PowerApps Control Framework. We're going to take a small look at that. We're also going to look at building flows and look at building custom connectors. Now, arguably, we can have a lot of developer coverage of the common data service and model-driven apps, but there's just not enough time. So those just kind of got cut from today's 1 hour webinar. So what we want to look at now is what are the challenges that we find building Canvas apps? Well, I see a lot of different companies coming to our training, and I have someone from the IT staff or developer who's just scared to death because they're just about to unleash 200 business users to start building Canvas apps and flows. So there's this notion of the Power Apps Maker. And that's someone who's going to be building applications and might not necessarily have a background in IT or with data or with any type of software development. But still, this maker is responsible for designing and building applications, testing them, ensuring there's good performance. And so some of the challenges is that we need to figure out how to build projects, not that are 2 or 3 screens, but get to 20 or 30 or 50 screens and still, maintain an ease to be able to update them and to be able to continue to extend them and add new things inside there. One of the other issues that we have is getting up to speed on team-based development. And, up to now, generally when you're building Canvas apps, it's only one person can develop at a time. But now as we start working with PowerApps Components and PowerApps Controls, it kind of increases our ability, to specialize our development into component-based approaches. Okay, now, one thing I want to point out is that there's a great white paper that was written by a good MVP friend, Todd Baginski, and Pat Dunn from Microsoft. And this kind of lays out some guidelines for naming screens, naming controls, kind of obvious stuff, but someone had to put a stake in the ground and said, here's, a starting point. In your company, you can deviate from these guidelines, but you should still have some kind of guidelines. So now what I'm going to demo, let's go ahead and kind of move back over here. And so what I'm going to begin by doing is I'm going to go ahead and bring up the browser here. Let's go back over and take a look at my Power App. And so one of the demos that I would like to show here, I'm going to go over to my environment. And within this environment, we have the custom ordering with Azure SQL. Now, let me begin by moving back here and kind of taking a look. Here is a Azure SQL database. So if we go back to portal.azure.com, and inside of my SQL servers, I have a CPT SQL, which is basically just a regular Azure SQL database server. And we have this database, which is the Power Apps Lab. Now, here, you can kind of see that we can get and create tables inside there. So I have a very simple data model that we're going to use here. And then also, we've got this Power App. Let's go ahead, and I'm going to open this thing up in edit mode. So here, we have a couple different screens. And so one of the things that we see is that when you create a Canvas app, the screen names are read aloud by screen readers for anybody that has visual impairments. So what we see is that when we create Power Apps, generally we take our screen names and we give them very readable names. And a common technique is just to end the name of the screen with the word screen, because as people with screen readers go from screen to screen, the screen reader is going to say, add customer screen, browse customer screen. Okay, also, as we get in and start looking at our controls, that we've added inside, you're going to see that we give them intelligent names. Let me go ahead and kind of move back to my slides here. And once we have, naming conventions established, it's going to be much easier to look at a screen and know exactly what we have. One thing to note is that a control doesn't just have to have a unique name, within a screen. A control has to have a unique name across the entire application. And so quite often we're copying and pasting controls from one screen to another. And so adding something about the hosting screen name into the name, gets to be a common technique, just so we don't have to guess what the name thinks. Okay, now the other thing we have to come to terms with is that when we start creating Canvas apps, it's all about writing formulas in the Power Apps formula language. The formula language of Power Apps was created to be Excel-like, so we don't need all you people that know C# and can program in Java. It's basically meant for business users. But still, what we'll see is that it gets to be, important to be able to write these expressions So for instance, as we go and we start looking at, our different forms, and, we look at a particular button and we look behind it, we can kind of see, what is the expression that's happening inside there. Okay, so being able to write expressions is important. Now, one thing that gets to be very common in Power Apps is that you design your application using state, and then you have your UI look at the state to render itself. Now, I've never heard anyone else use this comparison, but to me, working with Power Apps is very much like developing with React.js. You have components, you have state, and basically all your rendering logic looks at the state to do the rendering. And then you have other parts of your application that update the state, which automatically triggers basically a refresh. And so what we'll find is that, things are very much like that. So let's look at an example. So I'm going to go ahead and run this application. So let's say I go ahead and start at the welcome screen, and now we go to the browse customer screen. So I want to create some type of a filter. For instance, I want to go ahead and click on M, and I want to just see the customers, whose name starts with M. It's taking a second to warm this up. Whenever you see the little dots running across. But what we're able to do, is to basically set filters. And, as we, type things in and be able to run them, have the filter working. Now, the way that we've done that is to basically, let's go close this down. And what you'll see is that if I click on one of these buttons, it's going to update a variable, a screen level variable called loc, and LOC is my abbreviation for local, so we know it's not global, and a customer filter. Well, now we'll look at something else. We'll basically look at the items collection of this gallery. Now, when I drop this down, note that you have this ability to start formatting text. And one of the things that just kind of gets to be tedious and gets some taking used to is being able to work and write your code, in these little expression text boxes. And, being able to remove the formatting or apply the formatting, gets to be an important thing. Okay, now let's go a little bit further here with my slides. We also have events, and an obvious event would be someone clicking on a button and you want some code to respond. So we basically look at the different types of events, and they all start with on. And note that if I go to a particular element inside here, for instance, let's go to a particular button, and then I look at the different properties. If I find any of the properties that start with on, that's an event handler. And typically the things that we put inside there aren't just changing, aren't just reading values, but they're actually changing the state behind either a screen or the entire application. Now, quite often you write expressions just to evaluate, to set a title, or to set a default value. But sometimes we need imperative logic. We need the click of a button, to result in me doing something like setting the value of a global variable. So what you're able to do is you're able to start adding event handlers with different, what I'm going to call action expressions. So here's an example. And note that as we look at things, such as, let's say I go to the customer, add customer screen, and, what's going to happen when someone, clicks this button right here? Well, we're going to submit the form. And then if I go and we take a look at the form itself, and the form is going to have a couple different things, such as on success. So what's going to happen after I take a form and the form successfully writes to the SQL database? Well, I want to reset the form. I want to update the context. And note that if you're going to have multiple expressions, they just have to have the semicolon behind it. Okay. Now, let's see this application in action for a second. The way this application works is that we kind of start by having a set of customers. We can then add customers inside here. And I've got a little part of the demonstration that uses a custom connector. So if I click this button right here, it's going to basically just import customer data. It just kind of generates customers from random customer names. And once I find one that I like, I can go ahead and hit save. Now, once we hit save, we basically save that particular customer. Okay, now once we have saved a customer, what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to fill up a shopping cart for that customer and basically save that data back. Okay, now in our case right here, let's say that I take a particular customer. So we'll take this new customer, Joel Donovan, and we now want to create a shopping cart for this customer. So let's say that now this customer wants to buy a couple different products right here, and maybe we'll go to remote control and we'll take the Stomper Bully and add that inside. Okay, and then we want to go ahead and check out. So now we have something that's going to submit our order, and it's going to add an order record to the orders table. Now, let's go back here, and we'll take a look at our customers table here. And once we take a look at the customers table, we'll also take a look at the order details table. Okay, so we've got these two tables right here, and let's go back here and submit our order. And so what we want to see here is, after submitting this particular order, we want to be able to verify that things, really worked. So we want to be able to go back and verify that the order record got written. And then after the order record was written, we took the ID from that order record, and we were able to basically go through and push it, into the database. Okay, now let's go ahead and do a refresh inside here. You can see that has gone through. If I go back and we kind of take a look at the order details table, we basically put a couple different items, into this order number 2. Okay, now that we've done that, let's go ahead and look at some of the things that allow us to build the application. Now, note that screens have an on-visible event handler, but a couple months back, just about the beginning of the year, they added a application-wide on-start event. So the idea is that, as I'm working with my application, I am able to, let's go back here and go up into my app and get to the on-start. So here's how I can initialize, different parts of my application. Now, I just wanted to kind of include a listing of the declarative functions that don't do anything, they return a value, and the imperative functions that actually do something. Okay, I'm just going to leave that here for your reference. Now, some of the other things that I found is that when we design screens, what gets to be very common is to use relative styling. So for instance, if I have, just to show a very simple example right here, let's say that I go back and I add a new screen, and then inside of my screen, I add a label, and after I add that label, let's go ahead and add a text box. Now, what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to go and just make this a very simple demo, but we're going to go and take these two controls. And so first of all, let's go ahead and rename txt demo. And now this one is going to be LBL demo. So just get in the habit of renaming controls right when you create them. But what I want to show here is let's go to a certain property and note that every single control property, and the one I want to look at right here is the X property. And instead of hard coding the value, what we're going to do is we're going to basically just take the LBL demo and take its X property. And the idea is now as I start moving this, around my screen, I don't have to worry so much about adjusting the other control. And so one of the techniques that people like to use is they'll create one control and start creating other controls that look at its X property or Y property or width and height or size or fill. And so you can basically make it so that when it's time to adjust a screen, we just have to, adjust one or a handful of controls, and all the other controls just adapt because we've used relative styling. Okay, now also we can work with edit forms. Now I don't want to get into an extended discussion of edit forms, but what I'll say is that edit forms can make things easier. And when you create an edit form that does exactly what an edit form is supposed to do, it works well. But there are other times where we work with edit forms and it's not a very good fit. So in addition to edit forms, there's also a patch statement. And the idea of patch is that you can just put text boxes on a screen and you can have a button, and when someone clicks the button, you can simply read values from those text boxes and use a patch function to basically write into the database. And we're going to see some examples of that coming up. Now, here is the biggest design issue that you are going to encounter, and that is when you create a new application, how are you going to start managing the state? So what you'll see is that when you click on a button, that button can't walk up to a text box and change its default value. But that button, when you click it, can change a context variable or a global variable, and that change can trigger basically changing the default property of another control. So in things that I want to change over the course of an application, I need to start creating variables for. And we have collections, and when we use collections, we're using methods like collect to add something, clear to get rid of it, and clear collect to empty it and then add in new data. Note that collections also allow you, if you're working on mobile devices, not only to store state in records, but to be able to persist into some type of storage. And for mobile devices, it's the type of storage that mobile devices can write into, and then they're able to load data back in. Now, two other types of variables are context variables, which are local to a screen, and then global variables, which we create, which are application-wide. Now, let's look at an example. I want to be able to have these different products, and I want to be able to update them. So how do we, achieve that effect? If I go back to the Browse Product screen, and we take a look at this one particular gallery, which is the products gallery, we're going to see that it doesn't just pull data directly from the products table in SQL. Instead, we're going to do something different. So we're going to start by, inside of app.start, calling clear collect, and we're going to take the products table, we're going to add it into memory, into a collection which is called call product catalog, and we're going to add a new column using add columns. The idea is that if you add a column, you have something in memory that you can update on a per product basis. Now, once we've done that, what we're able to do is create a gallery, and note that as we create this gallery, we can look at the quantity, but also as we look at these little up and down buttons, what we can see is that since we've got that updatable column we've just added to memory, we're able to kind of create user interface experiences where people are able to kind of change the quantity, for an individual product, before they add it into their shopping cart. Okay. Now, let's also look at this final piece where it's time for us to write data, and we have to write data into that SQL database. So what we've done is we basically built this shopping cart in memory. Note that when you're using Power Apps, you're going to have different things, such as add to cart. And here is how I add something, into my shopping cart. And note that when I add something into my shopping cart, it looks a lot like JavaScript object notation. You're basically creating an object, and dynamically I'm figuring out, what the product ID is, what the quantity is. Note that when I create this object to push into the shopping cart, I'm also adding a total column inside there. So we're kind of fabricating columns just because of my needs to populate the UI. Now, if I go to the View menu and I choose Collections, you can also get a look at what we're saving. So here is our shopping cart data inside here. Let's say that we go back here, and if I look at the empty shopping cart, I can just call clear shopping cart to basically wipe it out. So let's go back here. I'll call clear shopping cart. And now let's go ahead and add a couple things back inside there. And once again, as you're developing and building out your application, you can just kind of stop and go look at your collection and kind of see what it looks like, after adding those items inside there. Now, the key point here is that what we'd like to do is we'd like to kind of build out a shopping cart, and we do it across two screens. So in our application right here, it's the Browse Product screen that allows you to build out the shopping cart. But then once we have built out the shopping cart, we're going to go to the Submit Order screen. And what's going to happen when someone clicks on Submit Order? So what we're going to do is we're going to take that collection, which doesn't really exist until after you push things into the database. But we're going to create a collection called Last Order. Now, we're going to call the patch function, and we're going to say, I want to write into that orders table. And the second argument to patch is the default values for the columns. And so there's this trick where you call defaults and you pass the table name. Now, the next thing is, what do we want to write inside there? So here's an example of taking the customer ID, which we're pulling from a gallery, in another screen. We're going to basically write the order amount inside there. And note that I can take something like a shopping cart and I can sum up one of the columns inside, and we're going to put today's order date. Now, what's important to see is that when we execute that, let's go back to Collections and call Last Order. And what you can see is that when you call patch, it gives you a return value, which is a record, or possibly multiple records. In this case, it's going to be a single record. And one of the things that you're able to see inside there is that customer ID, which is important because now we have to write the child records with that ID inside there. Okay, now going back here, and somehow it looks like I've just fallen out. Okay, PowerApps did not like what I was doing right there, so let me go ahead and open it one more time. Oh, no, it's coming back. Okay, now it's back. But what I was trying to get at here is when we click on this Submit Order screen, and now we start filling things from inside here, what I want you to see is that there are two individual statements, and they both start with clear collect. The first one adds this call last order. Now, when it's time to basically write the shopping cart data out to the order details table, now we have a for all. And once again, just to kind of show you exactly what's going on, if I go back here and we take a look at variables, no, not variables, I'm sorry. If we take a look at collections and we look at the shopping cart, okay, the shopping cart, and there's nothing in the shopping cart, forgive me, let me go back, and somehow everything kind of got blanked out. So let's go back here, add a couple things to the shopping cart. But the trick that we're using here is that when we look at our shopping cart and we have multiple items, we need to enumerate through these items one by one and create an insert statement to execute against that back-end database. So once again, if we go back here to Submit Order, what we're going to be doing in the second clear collect is to be enumerating through the shopping cart one by one, having another patch statement, one for each order detail, and we're going to write into that order detail table and note that we're able to get the parent record by going back to our collection, taking the first and taking the order ID. So when I write inside there, basically we've got the order information, which includes the customer ID, and we're able to take that the order ID, and basically write it in all the child records. And the other thing is that when you display the information that shows that the order has been successfully submitted, I'm using the collections that are the response from patch. That's what actually happened. If I use the shopping cart, I'd be saying, here's the data that I hope went into the database, but I'm not really sure. So basically taking the result of patch, gives you that advanced technique. Okay, now let's go ahead. We're going to look at a couple other topics. So the next topic we're going to look at is working with PowerApps Components. Now, components are new in the fact that they've been in preview for a few months. Let's see an example of a component. So first thing to note is that because components are not yet generally available, they haven't moved out of preview stage, you have to go to advanced settings. And in advanced settings for my Canvas app, I'm going to go down here and notice that we have preview features and then something that's kind of like preview features, which is called experimental features. And what you'll see is that there is components that has to be turned on. The idea of experimental features is that they're very early in the preview stage, and so they have a much higher likelihood of making changes to it that will break your code. So it kind of starts as experimental. Once it's still preview but more stable, they call it a preview, and then it will be released to GA. So what we're looking at here with components is going to be something where it is a experimental feature. Now, what I wanted to do is kind of show how we can create a reusable component. Now, let me back up a second. Components serve two purposes. I'm going to use it for the simple purpose, and that's within the context of a single Canvas app. I want to create something like a user control and ASP.NET that allows me to create a UI layout with behavior and then use it across many different screens. Now, there is a more advanced usage of components, which is probably going to be more important in the long run, and that is building a component that then can be packaged individually and used across many different applications. Okay, and that's basically part of the preview feature set that's still evolving pretty quickly. Now, let's go back here and I kind of take a look at the different screens that we have. Let's say that I go to my last screen right here, that screen that I created before. And so note that if I go to the Insert menu, at the very end, we basically have the different components, including the one I called Top Banner. And we'll go ahead and we'll add that in. And note that when you add those in, you get to create the screen title. So one of the things that you'll see here is that as we create components, we get to define custom properties. Now, this component is going to be added to every single page to create a common navigation. And so every page gets to set its screen title. Every page gets to set an app logo. And also note that we have something which is a navigation table. Now, one of the strange things that I found when I start working with components is you can't get a hold of the screens from the current application. And the reason for that is that components need to be decoupled. So what you then have to do is you have to kind of create some type of a navigation table. Now, if I create a property, that is a table, and note that when I work with components, that there's custom properties. If I add a custom property, note that there are many different types that you can use for your properties. And two of the most interesting ones are record and table. So I've added a table property and called it navigation table. Now here, I can basically go inside of my component, go to that custom property, initialize it with some default values. What's kind of interesting is that this also kind of defines the schema for the app that uses the component of how it has to push in its data. So what we'll do is we'll pass in a table that has records, and each record has a title called nav title, and then also can point to the screen. Now here, you can't really reference any screen, but this is just the sample data. And so once I've done that, let's go back, to one of these particular screens and see how it's going to be used. Now, you could put individual data to initialize this component in every single screen. However, kind of a neat trick is, let's go ahead and create a navigation table just as an application-wide collection. And so then the way that you initialize the component won't have to change across screens. So basically I've created this navigation table inside here. And now when I go to each of these screens and we basically go and take a look at this component, note that we have the title, which is going to be different, but each one is able to kind of use the same table inside there. And note that in our case right here, if we look at the component, the component has a gallery of menu buttons. And the idea is that it's then just able, within this gallery, just to create one button for each thing that you pass in. Okay, now with this, let's go back here and kind of see how it's going to work. So as I start the application and I start kind of going from one screen to another, things work, very easily. Plus, let's say I want to make a change. So being able to go back here and let's change home, to my CASA. And with that, let's go ahead and rerun that on start menu. And so now that we have done that, what we should be able to do is, basically change the text that we're going to see, across the whole application. Okay, somehow I didn't do that correctly, but hopefully that should give you the idea of, how this works. Now, when we talk about components, once again, a component would be something where I could go to components, I can now create a new component, and as I create a new component, I can call it anything that I want. Let's just leave this one as component, but you kind of just build a component as you would build a Canvas app. Once you've built that component, you can then go to different screens and basically take that component and add it inside there with the components menu. So it's really a component framework, for Canvas app makers. Now, going down one level, we have something else called the PowerApps Control Framework. And the PowerApps Control Framework is a full-blown developer framework for coding in TypeScript and basically building components, what they call controls that can be added into your Canvas apps and your model-driven apps. Now, to get this up and going, what you need to do is you need to install the PowerApps command line interface, or the PowerApps CLI, and basically which installs kind of the tools for the PowerApps Control Framework. Now, just to give you kind of a quick sample here, let's say that I'm going to switch my directory over to dev projects, and with that, let's make a directory, called my PA control. And so now that I've got that, let's switch over to this my PowerApps control folder. And here we're going to use a little cheater. And what is the name of this? It is the MPA control. So that's going to be the name of the control. Note that there is a namespace that we put it in. And then you have two templates, which are either field or data set. So the idea is that you have this command line utility, which is the PAC, PowerApps command line, and it calls the PCF, the PowerApps Control Framework. And what we should have at this point is that it should create a new project for me. Let's go ahead and type in code.space. And what you're going to see here is that now we have a project. And my project contains TypeScript. So for instance, now I have a component, and my component is something where truly at a developer level, I'm able to take this. Note that if I open up the NPA control or the control manifest input, you can kind of see that we're able to begin creating properties in here, just like you would for the component. But now the developer has complete control over which properties are input properties, which properties are output properties, and we can start using tool sets like React.js to create user experiences that we can readily just use inside of Canvas apps and model-driven apps. Okay, so it's very hard for me just to do a little coverage here, but here's a topic that deserves its own 1-hour webinar, which hopefully I'll put together over the next 2 months. Before everyone goes back to school, we'll have an hour-long introduction to the Power Apps control framework. Okay, now let's now move into working with Flow, and then also talking about custom connectors. So what we want is we want to be able to use Flow to basically automate various business processes. Maybe to take a bunch of data from a SharePoint 2010 site and basically migrate it to a SharePoint 2019 site. And the idea of Flow is that you have triggers. And a trigger is something that starts a flow executing. And then we have actions, which are the building blocks, which allow us to carry out tasks and make HTTP calls across the network. There's different services. And then there's this idea of connectors. So for instance, I could call into a custom web API using the HTTP connector, and then I want to take the data and write it to a SharePoint list, so I use the SharePoint connector. Now, we have many different types of triggers. Let's go back. And so what I want to do now is let's go back here, and let's go into Microsoft Flow. And if we create a new flow, and let's say I say, instant from blank, and we'll just kind of call this one Flow 1 for lack of a better name. And once we create this, it asks me to create a trigger. So let's say that I type in schedule. And what I can find is a trigger which is called recurrence. So if I want my flow to run once a minute, or once a day, I can simply have a flow whose trigger is recurrence. Now, other things that we can do is that I'm going to go ahead and delete that trigger, but every single flow has to start with a trigger. Maybe I'll go to something like SharePoint. And inside of SharePoint, what are the different triggers? Well, when someone adds a new item to a list, or when someone deletes a document, or you can also create triggers so that someone can select an item inside of a SharePoint list and then basically invoke the flow to start running, and the flow can pick up all the data from that particular item. So whether I'm using SharePoint or I'm using the common data service, there's great triggers inside there. Now, some of the other triggers, run when something happens. An item's created in SharePoint, a record's added to Dynamics 365. You can also create a trigger that basically just fires whenever someone submits an HTTP request to a certain endpoint. Okay, and then there's on-demand triggers. Sometimes I just want a trigger that doesn't really have much to do with the trigger other than a button in Flow or in my Canvas app. Okay, now as you start creating flows, now what we're going to do here is we're going to look at one of the flows that, let's go back. Sorry for jumping around here. But what I want to do is let's go ahead and look at this flow right here. And here's the flow behind this form. So what people did at the beginning, is that basically they went through and filled out this particular form. So let's go ahead and go back here. And, what is your name? It's Fred. Flintstone, and let me quickly put some data inside here. Where do you live? Rockville. I'm not sure that's really a place. How many years have you been a developer? And now let's kind of go through here and just pick a couple different things. And now let's go ahead and click on submit. So what we're going to see here is that if I wait a second or two and then I go ahead and hit refresh, what we can see is that, hey, a flow just ran 5 seconds ago. And if I kind of look at the history of a flow, what I should be able to kind of see is, well, we have this trigger, which was when a new form is submitted, and you can kind of see what the input data looks like. One thing I have to say is that Microsoft really pitches this Power Platform doesn't require developers, and there are many parts of Power BI and creating things like Canvas apps where that is true, and I would agree with it. But once you get into Flow, there's all these rat holes that the non-technical people fall into because they start having to parse JSON or put together an HTTP request. So I just find that Flow kind of drops you down into you better be a developer territory, more than the other two. Now, let's go ahead and go into edit mode here to kind of see how I put this together. So there is a trigger that allows me to kind of point to the form that I've created. Okay. Note that if we go to Microsoft Forms, I won't go much into creating these forms in here, but there is the ability for you to kind of put together a user interface experience to put together a survey. And I'll make the comment that I think they should do a lot more by allowing us to kind of have rich data entry, but I find there's a small set and you can put together a pretty reasonable survey with those. But now what we're going to do is every time this trigger fires, it basically gives me one or more forms. And so then I'm going to process each survey request. And the reason we need this kind of apply to each loop right here is because when this fires, you're not guaranteed to have just one form. There might be several forms because it only polls, every couple seconds or maybe once every couple minutes, depending on what type of license you have. Now here, this loop is going to fire once for each form. So note I can get response details. And now we have a Power BI data set. Now, a little bit of background on this data set. Before I jump into that, let's go back and let's kind of take a look at, what I was trying to build, with attendee surveys, and then we have this dashboard right here. We got to see 33 people responded. We kind of see that lots of you know HTML and JavaScript. Plenty of you know C#, and going down here, a couple of you know Python. Okay, we see some of the other web services. But if I now go to the data set and I say, let me create a report, what you can see here is I've created a real-time data set, and that's something that's a little bit tricky to do. And the idea is that, let's go back to Visual Studio. To create a push data set, you can do that in Power BI by going to, inside the context of a workspace. I can go down here and I can say create streaming data set, and I can create a streaming data set using this interface, but it's very limited because you can only create a streaming data set that has a single table, and you only get to define columns and the types, but you can't define things like format strings or have measures with DAX expressions. So if you're willing to define the JSON for one of these data sets yourself, so here is a C# program I wrote so I could put together some JSON, and the idea is that if I'm able to submit this JSON to the Power BI Service API in just a post request, well, I can create this data set right here, that's a lot more full-featured. And so with this particular data set, sorry, I'm jumping around here, what we're able to do, is basically build forms and reports. Now, let's go back here. And what you can see is that for each one of these forms, we're going to basically add a response row, to this first table right here. Let's say back here. Let me go back to data sets. Let me open this up one more time. So you can see that we have attendee skills. And, while I won't show you the names, we can basically take a look at, what the skills are. If I look at the survey response and we don't put the name inside there just so I don't reveal who you are, you can kind of see that we have a couple different tables inside here. Let's go ahead and create a second one. But for each one of these rows inside here, we were able to kind of build these two different tables. And here, what's going to happen when it's time to get the languages? So for instance, down here, we have a list that takes multiple values. So forms makes it a lot easier if you only take one thing at a time. But when someone selects multiple things inside here, let me go back here. Let me show you if I go back and look at one of these runs inside here. So what I really like being able to do is run a flow and go back and see the data that came back. And so what you can see here is if we look at the original response details, and now we kind of drill inside here, this is basically just the ID for that question. And what you can see is that they put together JavaScript object notation and just a simple array. But there's this little issue where when, if this is a collection that has things, when it's empty, it returns a blank screen or a blank string, as opposed to the syntax for an empty JavaScript array. So then what we end up doing is something kind of tricky here. If we go back and we kind of look at languages, we have to write a tricky expression. And if I take this expression right here, and let me go ahead and kind of open it up inside of Notepad, what you can see is we're basically having this if statement. If the value equals an empty string, we'll then change it into a JSON empty array. And if not, if it has values, give me the array. And so once we've done that, what we're able to do is we're able to then process the languages with an apply to each. And inside this apply to each, we're basically just adding rows individually. And then the rest I've kind of built out with Power BI Desktop. Okay. So, once again, once you start building flows, just kind of getting comfortable with being able to read and write data and being able to use the core actions from the control category for control of flow, creating variables, and doing, data compose operations. Okay. Now, also, let's say that I want to call into some service, and I'll just pick the Microsoft Graph API, but Microsoft hasn't provided a connector. So by using Flow in the HTTP connector, you can basically call anything that you want. So for instance, I can call the HTTP connector, and one of the things that we can do is we can start adding in, things like access tokens into the authorization header. We can fill in the accept header. So if you've worked as a developer working with HTTP requests and dealing with the responses, you're going to kind of have a natural ability, to pick it up pretty quickly. Now, for instance, let's say I call to a web service and I get data back. Well, there's something which is called parse JSON. To take that JSON, kind of convert it into just a friendly object inside of Flow. And what you're able to do is take a sample payload of what the JSON should look like and copy it and paste it, into a form for the parse JSON action, and will automatically create the JSON schema to do the conversion for you. Okay, let's end with this idea of a custom connector. So one of the things that I wanted to use in this demo And now we're going to have to go back where we were earlier. And so that was, give me one second, back here. And so inside of Power Apps, there's this notion of custom connectors. Now, with a custom connector, what we have is something that you're able to put together, and it defines things like there's a host and there is a API inside there. Now, for this demo, what I wanted to do, let's go to the definition here, and inside of the definition for get next customer, let's say that I just take this URL at first, and with that URL, if I go here and see the next customer, one of the things that you can see here is that each time I click it, it just returns a nice piece of JSON. So with this demo, one of the things that I've decided to do is just kind of provide a web service that doesn't have security. So it's via anonymous access. So it's not exactly real world, but it kind of allows me to kind of teach students, how we're going to build a custom connector. And then as we deal with things like the response, we're able to take that JSON, coming back, we're able to, then, inside of this environment, let's go back here, if I need to import from sample, and now, the idea is that if I'm able to kind of take the JSON, add it inside there, and go ahead and click import, it's going to shape the data for us. Now, once you've created a custom connector, let's go back here, and you can see I've created this custom connector. You can start using it from different applications. So here's a Canvas app right here, and if I view and data sources, we're going to see that the next customer API is inside there. If I look at the customer, the add customer screen, and we look at this button right here, you can basically see that when I want to call out to that custom web service through my custom connector, I've made it so that I click on a button and I call next customer API.next customer, and I load that customer into memory. Okay. So it just kind of gives you an example of, starting to work with custom connectors. Okay, now we're just about out of time here, but one of the things that I wanted to do is just to basically look at PowerApps and Flow, but not in a dummy down way, in a perspective of professional developers who want to pick up the things quickly and be able to, get to being able to create, large-scale applications, using Canvas apps and using flows. Okay. Now, at this point, let me once again point out that, if you like this type of training, in Power Apps and Flow at an advanced level, at Critical Path Training, we have a new course, which is Building Business Solutions with Power Apps and Flow. If I just take a quick second to go over to criticalpathtraining.com, what you can see here is, let's go ahead and move into courses. And we have some courses that are just day of. Day of Building Business Solutions with Power Apps, Day of Building Business Solutions with Flow. And, they get into this same advanced content that we looked at today, except you'll do hands-on labs and you'll basically build out that customer ordering app. And then there is the 3-day version that has the Power Apps and Flow coverage, and also starts, moving into working with custom connectors, and also working with the common data service and building model-driven apps. So hopefully that is of interest to you. If you go ahead and look at the Critical Path schedule, it'll basically show you the dates. We have 2 day of classes this week, and that Building Business Solutions with Power Apps and Flow starting next week. So we have the top of the hour. Thanks everyone very much for coming and spending the hour with us. Hopefully this kind of opened up your eyes about what's possible, and we'd love to hear more. This video will be available up on YouTube within the next day or so, and we'll send a follow-up email. So once again, thanks everyone for attending today, and I hope you enjoyed and learned something useful. Thanks very much.